Hi, welcome everyone to today's I4C webinar on emissions data and ESG, what's next, regulation and reporting. Before we begin, I would like to go over some of our housekeeping rules. Please make sure to mute your audio and turn off your video. If you just participated in our live poll to let us know which country and sector you're joining from, feel free to type that in the chat as well. Please submit your questions in the WebEx chat panel, and you can also view the chat panel for helpful information from the hosts and the panelists today. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the I4C website. If you're sharing on social media, please use the hashtag #InnovateForClimate. And now I'd like to pass it on to Mr. Todd Bridges from Arabesque to moderate today's session. Todd, over to you.
All right, wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Todd Bridges. I head up sustainable investing and ESG research at Arabesque, which some of you are aware of, some of you are not. It's a data research advisory technology firm. And also asset management. So we're a bit of a hybrid firm. I'm very honored to be able to moderate this discussion. We have some amazing speakers and panelists, and also the subject matter itself is intellectually interesting, but also the ability for us to bring about systemic change and make sure that our form of capitalism, if you will, is prepared for the low carbon energy transition. So let me just briefly, of course, give a summary of where we are. And again, for those who are experts in the field, this will be a little bit of a review, but let me just give a few minutes and then kick it over to the introduction to the speakers, the experts, if you will. And then we'll go through a series of questions. Just to level set, again, for 20 plus years, the scientific community has reached almost consensus, universal consensus, that we and our economic systems that we've been designing and building are resulting in some negative externalities, right? In particular, the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from a carbon-based economy are causing great concerns at the Earth atmospheric systems. All data has suggested that we are the cause. And now, over the last approximately 5 years since the Paris Agreement, now there's a broad consensus around the globe at the political level, but also more importantly for us today at the capital market level, where investors and corporations are becoming the critical actors for bringing about potential change. So, again, it is important that, the panelists today, the speakers are experts across all different key institutional actors, right? So former central banks, advisors, they have a regulatory perspective, they have a corporate perspective, one of the leading corporates in the field on this matter of GHG emissions, oil and gas. One of the largest asset managers in Europe, of course, we're looking forward to hearing from him. And then, of course, I think it's important that we have deep insight into the actual, what is GHG? What is the state of ESG reporting and data disclosure? So Kathy from IHS Markit. And so before we get there, I think it's critical that we don't see this as a political initiative, right? So 2015, of course, the Paris Agreement put us on a new trajectory where 190 plus nations, of course, came around the table and agreed to make systemic change. But, those are nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that are a little bit fuzzy, a little bit vague, and they don't have a lot of teeth. So it's the actual market participants that will bring about change. And it's not because of any other reasons, but sustainability has been shown to be linked to the financial system and investment portfolios. This is the key logic or argument of the central banks and the network for greening the financial system, for example. There is a link between climate risk and financial risk. The other dimensions are, systemic, as we build more and more sustainability products that are low carbon, for example, that are using GHG carbon emissions data to build and design, those products need to have some set of standards, and consumer protections need to be in place. So, you'll see regulations and reporting is really about trying to create product standards and protect the consumer. And then, final systemic reason that we're seeing such dramatic growth in this area is, of course, the financial system is linked to larger collective goals, right? So the climate boundaries that are built into all the scenario analysis by the IPCC or the IEA, those are collective goals. We have a collective action problem, which now these policies and regulations and market actors are trying to align with. It's difficult, but we'll address some of these concerns. So again, with that being said, let me just turn it over to some of the leading experts in the field. Quickly introduce them. I'll start with Kathy Crawford at IHS Markit. Do you want to just give a little summary of who you are and your expertise?
Hi, everyone. As Todd said, my name is Kathy Crawford, and I am a director of greenhouse gas accounting and estimation at IHS Markit. So my focus for the last couple of years is on the full value chains, the full life cycle of crude oil and natural gas. My career has been focused in general on greenhouse gas emissions reporting and reduction and mitigation opportunities, as well as energy efficiency opportunities. And I'm excited to be here today.
Excellent. Welcome. Let me turn it over to Julie Mulkerin.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Julie Mulkerin Ortiz. I work at Chevron in our Energy Transitions team, and I've been working on energy transitions topics with the company for a little more than a decade. My background is in trading and market development, so I try and look at where the intersection of market, policy, and sustainability topics come together for Chevron. Glad to be here today.
Excellent. Welcome. Moving down the list to Janku Deramus from Belgium.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I work as a senior sustainability analyst for Legal and General Investment Management, which is one of the world's largest institutional investors and the UK's largest asset manager, with a very big focus on sustainability. My role within that involves, on the one hand, engaging with investee companies, particularly high carbon companies, oil and gas and mining, on climate and stewardship issues, as well as the development of low carbon funds and ESG funds more broadly, responsible investment under another name, as well as advising clients on some of their sustainability strategies. Pleasure to join you all today.
All right, wonderful. And then last but not least, Ernesto Barbosa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining us. Years in sustainable finance, more recently advising the governor of the central bank in Mexico in terms of green finance, ESG, and the liaison with the NGFS. Before that, climate finance, more focused on housing, green housing projects in Mexico with multilateral development banks, and kind of developing the market. It's what I have been doing in terms of encountering relationship with social policy, climate change, and economic development as an emerging economy. So very happy to be here, share some on this matter.
All right, brilliant. Okay, so again, I think as we, the continuing conversation, I'm going to get more and more granular. So don't worry, we'll get into the very deep particulars of emissions and emissions data and reporting. But maybe let me just ask one of the one question back to Ernesto and maybe Janku, with respect to, why regulators, central banks, and exchanges want to help companies provide emissions information and formalize the reporting process. What is the key objective here for us? Maybe Ernesto, you want to handle that one from a regulatory and central bank perspective?
Yes, of course. Many thanks, Todd. I would say there's a shift of the perspective from the governments in terms of policy and also from the management of money and resources in central banks after Paris Agreement. As you may recall, the political aspect is also relevant on this matter after the US election in 2016. When we were in Marrakech, it was kind of difficult to see the election result and trying to understand what was coming in terms of the flow of money. in this type of aspects, I would say that central banks have been very concerned about how ministries of finance haven't been very active, I would say, in this type of conversations since the whole climate change conferences. As you may recall, these new ministries kind of new agenda and coalition is recent. So as we may recall, this is very new. Central banks have been kind of pushing forward these type of aspects because after the end of the G20's green finance and sustainable finance study groups, after these political aspects, the NGFS had to take into account or had to take part of this job alongside with the TCFD and the Bloomberg initiatives towards trying to understand the market dynamics and where are the gaps in terms of the necessities that we have from north to south, emerging, developed. We have momentums nowadays. NGFS has been moving forward. And I would say that the most recent statement from the NGFS is very relevant in 2018 in their first report, stating that climate and environmental risks are financial risks. So nowadays, ESG is part of the central bank's DNA in willingness, at least in developed economies, to understand better, in a better way, the aspects of environment, social, and governance. We could say that after COVID pandemic, the S has been one of the most relevant aspects that we have seen accelerating in this understanding. Before that, in the conversations with developed economies, the S wasn't very relevant. The S wasn't very really there. We were only focusing on the E. And the G was kind of very well in developed economies, very bad in emerging economies, as you may know, of many difficulties of the rule of law, corruption, etc. And opportunism in these matters, when you go into new data, into such acceleration of many providers, makes us think that we have to make a stop, analyze, and try to get some granularity of what we're looking at and give the investors the best of the information. So I would resume this first comment on the necessity and the great signal that central banks are sending to the world is that when the NGFS started with 8 central banks, including Banco de Mexico, as being founder and part of the steering committee, it's now 75 central banks around the globe and more than 12 observers, including the Bank of International Settlements, the Basel Committee, which is going to be greening itself. So the banks should be very aware of the new possibility of mandatory regulation. The IMF, the multilateral big banks, including the World Bank and the IFC. So there are many eyes looking at this quietly, silently, but developing research, getting along with academia and research institutions and experts to develop a more concise and precise analysis on this matter. So that's what I could say about the relevance today for central banks, top of the agenda. From the ones in the NGFS have to be, it's a coalition of the willing. So if the top is not really committed on this, it never happens going down on the chain of the departments in central banks. So it's very relevant, I would say, the 75 new or 75 central banks working on this network. So that would be my first comment on this.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, maybe Yanku, maybe with respect to taking it one further level down with respect to regulations, of course, affect the asset management industry and how you design products, how you report on said products. Climate products in particular. I know you and your team are building excellent climate-related products. How is the role of the regulators in structuring what needs to be reported on in climate parameters? And for example, also, what are your thoughts on the frameworks and standard bodies such as the TCFD? Those are dramatically improving potentially the GHG emissions data points.
Thank you, Todd. So I guess we're in absolute agreement, with the regulator on the comments you've just heard about the need to be looking at this, right? You start by thinking that climate risk is an investment risk, and the same reason the regulators are asking more is the same reason you would argue you didn't need regulation. You should have had people looking at this without the regulators saying it explicitly, right? And I think that's where we come from. Climate risk is a first-order investment risk, and we're building the tools to some degree partly independent of regulation because we see this is what responsible asset managers should be doing anyway. So that's one big start of the project, and I think it's very important. Indeed, the conversations we've been having with investee companies, predate some of the new regulation for a long, long time, and that's important that we're not coming at this with a fresh pair of eyes. That being said, it's undoubtedly true that regulation has had a transformative effect. I think we can look at it from the perspective of corporates more generally, who are facing increased regulation. In the UK, for example, where we operate just this week, there was further talk of mandating regulations, large listed companies to produce TCFD aligned, Task Force on Climate Related Disclosure aligned reporting. So that is definitely coming, and I think the same thing is happening in the EU. You can pretty much say that every aspect of the investment chain is targeted to some degree, be it from the end owners, the ultimate owners of capital, the asset owners, the pension funds, the insurers, who have to explain their approach to climate risks, how they're managing those risks, how they set their policies, and then they come to asset managers like Elgin, and the strength and ambition of client mandates is definitely increasing partly as a result of that. And then I think regulation is also driving further down the investment chain. The role of advisors, for example, under EU rules now, there's talk of advisors specifically asking clients about their sustainability preferences. So you don't just assume that because they don't care about these things. You're supposed to probe a bit deeper. And I think no doubt that is having a transformative effect. But it's changing processes. Definitely, it's getting more divisions, more people to talk to each other in different ways. I think that's quite interesting. You have maybe, the people doing certain kinds of risk reporting now have to talk to the sustainability teams because there's regulation calling for climate stress tests, if you will, in certain parts of the industry. All that is happening, and it's very important, I think. There's also a separate conversation which you touched on, I think, around labeling and reporting, say, of investment products, the EU taxonomy. There's all that happening. I think it'd be fair to say that to some degree the industry is finding its feet. I don't think there's common agreement upon everything now, and I think that's healthy disagreement. But having said all of that, you mentioned the TCFD in particular. We've been very big supporters of TCFD for a long time. We've been engaging with regulators to ask to mandate some of these elements which were previously voluntary, and we've been asking investee companies as well to report in line. We've done our own reporting in line with it, and we may start to vote against or potentially divest from certain companies where we do not believe the reporting and the strategies disclosed therein are up to scratch. So I think I should stop there. That was quite a long opening salvo.
Wonderful. So let me just follow up on that with getting us down into the quote unquote investee companies and the particulars of GHG emissions data. Julie and Kathy, you guys are both experts in different dimensions of this aspect. So maybe, again, Kathy, would you just perhaps frame the context of GHG emissions and what is it that the investor community or regulators and reporting standard bodies are starting to request? What is the nature of the GHG data currently, and where do we plan to go in the future?
Absolutely. So at IHS Markit, we believe that GHG estimation, reporting, and disclosure by companies is only going to accelerate. Some of my colleagues in IPREO within IHS Markit commissioned Merger Market to interview senior executives, sort of split a third between private equity, corporate entities, and asset managers to really try and understand the growing influence of ESG metrics within M&A and investment decisions. And what they found, similar to kind of what Janko was just talking about, is ESG is already ingrained. It's driving influence, but they also found that it's only going to increase. So they found that largely, the role or the importance of ESG is on the rise, with 80% of firms believing in that increase and 50% of those seeing that as a dramatic rise. And notably, none of them seeing it as declining. And of the ESG metrics, climate change or GHG emissions was the most important metric on its own. So the most respondents rated it as the number one issue. But aligning with what Ernesto mentioned earlier, kind of the ranking of 1, 2, and 3, we saw social being that higher metric. So I think it's fair to say that greenhouse gas emissions reporting is becoming much more commonplace and much more of an expectation. We're seeing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, certainly in the energy companies, being regularly reported, or consistently reported, I should say, and it is sort of that expectation. And what we are starting to see emerge is a much stronger pull for that scope 3, so broader emission set information. And I also wanted to flag that the survey that I spoke about, completed by my colleagues in IPREO, that it flagged some of the biggest challenges, being sort of determining how to find the relevant information and gaining access to that relevant information. So in some cases, something about what's being provided, it is missing the mark. And the second challenge that was sort of rated as the top challenge was comparability to the broader market. So how does what's being reported fit into that broader landscape? So I think really pointing to the challenges with consistency in what's being reported today. So we know that decisions that ESG and greenhouse gas emissions reporting is factoring into these investment decisions. And I think in the absence of data that's consistent and comparable being disclosed by companies, we're seeing the need to go elsewhere to third parties to find that information. And the risk there, I think, is that as a third party, we don't necessarily have the same quality or granularity of data to support greenhouse gas emission quantification that the companies do. And we're required to fill in any of the gaps with assumptions or, proxies, if you will. Yep. And so the risk there is that decisions end up getting made on data that isn't as high quality as it could be. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So I think we've got the foundations, but last but not least, I think we should definitely go to the corporate entity. We're all at the mercy of corporations, and we have the importance and one of the most important corporations in the world. Julie, would you mind just sharing with us how you view and how you and the team view GHG reporting? What is good reporting? And then you know this better than anyone, the complexities of how to capture that quantifiable data that is being asked by asset managers and data providers and everyone else.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I'll start off with a little bit of analogy drawing and talk about kind of building on what Kathy was talking about, where we're at in the state of reporting right now. So Chevron, as a player in the oil and gas sector, has been doing emissions reporting for roughly 15, 20 years. And if you think about the way emissions reporting was set up and what it was set up for, a lot of it was set up for national inventories. So if you're doing it for the purpose of collecting the data at the level of a particular jurisdiction, whether it be a state or a nation, right, the types of information that you're requesting from operators and what you're looking for is going to go to try and be at the fewest points of data collection. And if we think back 15 years ago, which, in some regards seems like forever ago, but in other regards is just yesterday, the kind of data and technology that was available 15 years ago to collect the information was really kind of bulky, right? So you had people trying to put this, how do you have a few people putting in the information to collect these national inventories to then try and look at where we are in meeting the world's greenhouse gas reduction goals? So what I equate it to is, we're trying to measure it on such a broad basis. And even some of the conversation from kind of where we started here is going from, kind of the central bank perspective and economy-wide to investor to company. And it's like we're trying to essentially go on a low-calorie diet without knowing how many calories are in any of the foods we eat. And then we're going to try and judge our diet based on the overall calories in supermarkets. So while that has information maybe for, it does have some information and it's definitely a benefit, we're trying to do this at a company level when the markets really operate, and kind of connecting back to my background in trading, markets really operate on a commodity basis. So if we want to get to the point where we as consumers and global society, or we as companies want to look for the lowest carbon intensity producers or the best performers on a carbon basis, I really think that it needs to go down to the product level basis and needs to be done in a way where it's dynamic and not static reporting. Going back to this national inventory concept, it's fine to do it on a once-a-year basis by a facility or aggregated by a company if you're looking at data once a year. But kind of, the way that the emissions inventory reporting system works is you're looking at the data from roughly a year to a year and a half in arrears. So it's really hard to manage. I mean, taking it back to my low-calorie diet analogy, it's really hard to manage what's happening today with information from a year and a half ago, right? Or sometimes I use an analogy of a bank account. Like, roughly maybe you have the same job, so you have roughly the same income. So how do you manage your budget with information from a year and a half ago? And so a lot of the initiatives that we're working on now, I think it's so exciting, and hopefully why we have so many people taking time out of their day to learn about or listen to us talk about accounting, which generally, if you tell your family and friends that you're calling to talk about emissions accounting, at least my family kind of goes, could you have someone else to talk about that with? But what we're trying to do is really go to this level of thinking about it on a product performance basis in a dynamic fashion. Again, kind of going back to the level of granularity that we're seeing in the technology that's available today. If you have a facility that produces one product all the time, like I was mentioning that same job, you roughly know what the emissions intensity is of the products you produce if you're producing the same products. On contrast, if you're a contract manufacturer or you switch products or you produce a number of different products, how the emissions gets allocated to each one of those individual products and over what time horizon is a differentiator. So, 15 years ago, and kind of where I started in thinking about this is 15 years ago, you could collect it, maybe you put it in a spreadsheet. I think there were spreadsheets 15 years ago, but where we are now is that we have the technology, the sensors, the digital tools that are finally becoming available to merge with this topic of emissions reporting to be able to do it in a way that's dynamic. So I think that, we work with a lot of other oil and gas industry players as well as cross industry through different initiatives to try and get it down to a standard way of approaching the issue so that we can get down to a carbon footprinting, tracking and tracing on a product level basis. So it's really an exciting time to be looking at things like accounting rules for emissions.
Well, that's amazing. Again, the insights there, I could spend probably an hour. So, unlike your family, I think I could probably definitely geek out on that set of questions, because everything you hit there was the future of ESG, or in this case, GHG emissions reporting, right? Moving away from once a year annual reporting and then making sure that those are somewhat comparable over time, which is always a difficult feat. And it's the primary objective of the regulators and the standards bodies. But they are going to be a little slow with respect to the adoption of new technologies, dynamic reporting, product level reporting, sensors, tools. That's the future. Again, the disconnects though are potentially massive between potentially a leader in the field of oil and gas having dynamic reporting, product level reporting, sensors that are already internally calibrated, and then how do you signal that to capital markets? How do you signal that to regulators? Right. So this is probably something that, I hope that you're engaging with the industry more broadly and trying to communicate how capital markets can start to calibrate. Again, I don't know, with respect to asset managers, Yanku, are you aware of kind of the changing form of reporting within climate data and, potentially ways in which your firm could pull this type of data? Is there any infrastructure in place that you know of, or?
That's a great question, and you're right. I think one thing to come up quite interestingly here is, right, backwards-looking data versus live quote-unquote data versus forward-looking, and I think investors are trying to capture all of these three as accurately as you can, right?
Right.
I know. So one of the things which I think is definitely a very exciting area, a new area, is around obviously live data, satellite tracking, things like that, and the fact that I think it's a big problem. For example, in the oil and gas industry, right? Everyone looks at carbon. You have to look slightly broader than carbon, other GHGs as well, particularly methane. A lot of the time, there's a kind of back of the envelope calculation as opposed to live on the ground sensors, which, right, unsurprisingly, almost every single time things turn out to be underestimated. So there's all that issue which needs to be addressing. And I think we're starting to have the tools, but we're not quite there yet, I think. There's a separate part, which I know is a very live conversation in asset management, which is around either your own modeling of forward-looking commitments by companies, or in the absence of explicit commitment by companies, you try and do the best you can. And I think this touches on the point that Kathy raised earlier around third-party data, right? Someone else will be telling your story if you're not telling it yourself. And with that in mind, in particular, one thing we spent a lot of time on is around this idea of scenario analysis and modeling different pathways of the energy future and the role of the companies in that. And linked to that, one notion in particular, one metric, which I think is growing in prominence, is the idea of temperature alignment. So the way we've done it with Belgium, for example, is if you took companies' past emissions performance and extrapolated that forward, relative to its sector and relative to global targets as well, what trajectories are companies on? And probably won't be surprising that if you take this approach, the vast majority of companies are not aligned with anything like a 2-degree future as per the Paris Agreement, let alone something more stringent like a 1.5-degree target. And that's interesting to me because obviously you could say you need to compare that against what companies say they will do as well. And that's obviously something which, the aggregation of forward-looking targets and all that is something that's a very live conversation. We're seeing many more data providers as well stepping up to the plate. And I think that's important forward-looking too, because I take the point that Julie just made. We need precise data, absolutely no question about it. And even if you don't, sometimes, I don't exactly know the calories in your calorie bar, but if they see that you're eating and you're really not exercising and you don't really have a plan for exercising more, I can sort of gauge the direction of travel. And both of these things matter quite a lot, I think, for investors. So that's the sum of it. Many data. We have things coming up. And obviously, I mentioned satellites. AI is something which I think maybe you would be much more well placed to talk about, actually, Todd, with what is happening in machine learning space and all that. And our Arbesk is doing great stuff, as well as internal modeling. So third-party data, companies self-disclosed, and internal modeling. All of these are coming to the plate, I think, and more asset managers are making use of them.
Yeah, brilliant. Again, I think it's open for all of the speakers here. And, with respect to all the issues that we just discussed, how can these standards bodies, or frameworks such as the TCFD or regulations, try to close this gap, right? I mean, the TCFD was a great advancement in the last few years, but maybe Julie, is that enough? Is that sufficient, right? I know Belgium is a big supporter. I know probably the Bank of Mexico and the exchanges are big supporters of the TCFD. But, Julie, I guess your opinion on the existing reporting and standards that are out there, do we have a gap here with respect to what is best for capital markets? And then, how do we close that gap, or how do we standardize, high quality forward-looking data as well?
So I think the TCFD report has been, and that alignment around kind of those 4 categories of governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics is really helpful for starting the conversation. Chevron was one of the first companies to issue a TCFD aligned report. In fact, I have, going back to what friends and family don't want to talk about, I have, my well-loved report, the first one, and still use it. And I'm always taking ideas if people ever want to actually come over on what we can put in our next one. And that's great for kind of this company overview. Where I think some of the metrics would be useful in going is really asking for performance on the products that companies are producing. Because a lot of what's being managed right now is managing with a demand issue with a supply, asking companies that are supplying to produce information at an aggregate level, which is really hard then if you go back to the markets and say, well, how do we know that the companies are among the best performers in whatever category they're producing? So going back to my supermarket example, if you have some basic things like beans and rice, but you also have potato chips, all of some of my favorite foods, right? You don't know what the balance of those, really what the performance or how the manufacturing process is for any of those individual items. So when you think about kind of Tcfd reporting, which has come a long way, if we think about it was just 3 years ago that the final recommendations were made and how many companies are now producing them. IHS Markit has a really cool platform where you can go in and put the information, look it up from all the companies where it's taking all the data metrics and the reports in one place. So you have all these bodies that are emerging to have that level of information. And now I think we need to take it one step further down to that commodity level basis. So the standard setters, I think, are interesting, but when I think about how emissions reporting is done, it's usually done sector by sector. And there are a lot of commonalities between sectors that have to be decided on. So one of the most interesting topics right now is emissions allocations and co-product reporting, right? So before I was in oil and gas, I was in agriculture. And so I think that's almost some of the easier analogies. But if we take, for example, a plant that produces soybean oil and soybean meal, right? How do you allocate the emissions among two products that are fairly basic, right? This is a very simple facility. And I think if I take agriculture or oil and gas industry or kind of primary materials producers, it's an easier place to start than manufactured components. And you could say, well, if the purpose of a plant is to produce, let's say, soybean oil, what is the soybean meal in this example? What are the emissions associated with that? Is that an emissions-free product? Do you take it based on an energy output basis? These types of things really go beyond, like if I relate that back to oil and gas, in an oil and gas producer, we may have wells that produce both oil and gas. So maybe the intent of the well was to produce oil, but you also produce associated gas. Does that associated gas, should that be emissions-free, right? You have these common elements between sectors that I think has been really helpful for us to work with other companies in trying to solve. Because when you get to going back to my supermarket example, right? It's really easy when you're looking at some of those basic raw materials like rice and beans. It's really easier to know kind of the calorie count or the process that was used or the emissions in this case, since I'm talking about something like oil and gas, versus when you get to something more complex like chemicals for oil and gas sector, or say like a cookie, right, back to my supermarket. So you have to get kind of these building blocks lined up in a similar fashion across industry. So I think it'll come through some regulatory agency and standard setting bodies later. But I think that a lot of the companies right now are trying to work together to figure out some of these common methodology decisions of how to take it and then socializing it with larger groups to try and figure out a common approach to whether it be a timing issue, an emissions allocation information, what level of product you go down to. That's really important to try and work through this if we want to get to the eventual goal of kind of carbon footprinting and going to a lower carbon future.
Yeah, again, I think let me just take a little bit of stock here. This notion that over the last, you said 15 plus years, carbon emissions in the GHG began at country, kind of national inventories, right? As we move down the primary investment portfolios, well, again, fixed income sovereigns, munis, and then, of course, the corporate entity. So we have this need for data at different levels of granularity and different forms of aggregation. right? So this is a problem that we always deal with, not only on the data research side, but also the investment models, is that can you aggregate up at a product level, the carbon intensity at product levels to corporate, from corporate up, or do you have to have new forms of reporting at different levels, right? This is kind of the problem of making sure that the language of capital markets and institutional investors who deal with instruments have data that's at the appropriate level, right? So that's a fundamental problem, and regulators are trying to do their best at the corporate entity, and certain organizations, of course, have tried to address this at the sovereign. So now, I love the discussion, and we're moving down into complexities of dynamic reporting at the product level. But now an industry-specific product level decisions, right? So that's amazing level of granularity. But now the fundamental problem is, how do we aggregate up, and how do we connect that information at different levels to capital markets to be properly allocating capital, right? Or central banks to manage risk. I don't know, the country versus company question. Any stance on that, or how you've solved it, or how you've addressed it in your reporting or investment management process?
Todd, if I may, I would just try to set back a little bit on the building blocks of this from the side of the government for public policy or policymakers and central banks. As we have seen in the discussion, that's how it started with me. It's essential that we deepen the systematic assessment of ESG risks. I would say that's the main thesis. The common language, I would say the momentum in Europe with the taxonomy, that kind of gives a big signal against what China had did before that, because the Chinese taxonomy had many inputs from government that could be greenwashing, ESG washing stuff. I would say that this common language is what every jurisdiction should do. I would not say that we could have a universal taxonomy, global taxonomy. It will be very difficult because of every jurisdiction's complexities, developments, climate zones, geographically, the supply chains, technology. The housing sector, for example, is a very good example of how you can translate German, Austrian passive house technologies and methodologies and simulation tools toward the Mexican context in a very different zone. But you can do that, tropicalizing this stuff. And I would say that could be the same in many other of the sectors that we can see as the most carbon intensive as transport or oil and gas. But I would say this framework would be the building block, and that's what we have been doing in Mexico from the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, alongside with the private sector, mainly the banking sector and the pension funds, in terms of regulation, which is now regulated. The pension funds have to submit information about the ESG risks. So this would be easier for everyone to identify the issues. I mean, the good news is that we have the TCFD. There have been some assessments of other type of reporting, GRI, SASB, and there's a strong alignment. Nevertheless, I would say that we still lack this external audit that can really say the things are as we say, and then we come to the same discussion. So we have the data aggregators, we have the rate of the raters, we have so many information and transaction costs that, for example, for SMEs or for underdeveloped countries, it makes it more expensive and more difficult to become part of this trend. And so we start to see bridging or expanding these gaps, and that's what we have seen with the pandemic in terms of inequalities that have been expanding in many social aspects and economic aspects. And I would also say that institutional investors or investors in general have many ways in which they can impact the real economy in terms of asking for more financial materiality related to the ESG and climate issues, this type of disclosure, the impact of the risk analysis on asset prices and financial flows, that the valuation of assets is also underdeveloped. We have seen what's happening in the housing sector in the coasts, at least in the US, that is the most concerning thing nowadays in their agenda in terms of the mortgage crisis that could come in some years. We have seen increasingly also the influence to trigger corporate actions at Climate Action 100 that have decided to include some focus in their focus list some oil and gas companies, state-owned, such as Pemex of Mexico, some mining companies of Mexico that have very bad reputation, such as Grupo Mexico. So I think company data is very relevant, but it's not all, as we have seen in the conversation, Julie, Yanku, Kathy. It's not just isolated data that we have and where we can have information. It's how these companies are making a comprehensive evaluation of this data and how they are taking hands-on to recognize the risks and the opportunities of these environmental and climate risks. I think that the opportunities are on this because companies are not seeing this long-term view in this tragedy of the horizon. But as we have seen in the pandemic, the trends of ESG performance has been interesting. The PRI also stated that 2019 was a historic year in terms of the policy response. So I would say that companies that were better accompanied of criteria related to climate change and ESG are the better performers these years. Companies that had flexibility of work, companies that had good S, good G, are performing better than the ones that didn't have that. And that's what we're going to be seeing in the next couple of years in their performance and their ESG scores. And last but not least, in my comment, many things to be done in terms of how we assess these scores. We see companies with 4 different rating agencies with 4 very different scores. We have to improve transparency. The methodologies are very opaque. The opacity is complex to analyze information. We have seen more granularity, for example, with RobecoSAM and S&P in terms of having information per question for the companies that are being assessed. That's what has been pushing forward, regulation, and we need more disclosure, more transparency. And also talking about the small caps versus the large caps companies. Maybe small caps companies cannot provide many information or reporting, or the human resources or human capital to provide so much reporting information, etc. So I think we are going to see this alignation or this alignment of incentives and regulation, and the markets are going to be from the demand side also being having a lot of pressure towards these aspects. And of course, I would say there's a need and an urgent need for the regulators, central banks, supervisors, and also the ministers of finance to improve their whole agenda in terms of budgeting, in terms of improving disclosure regulation. For example, Tcfd should be the building block of a soft regulation globally for having information, at least in terms of the information that is important or relevant in terms of ESG. And I would say that's the next steps, the things that are coming, and that we have to be very awake in terms of monitoring the signals from the BIS, the NGFS, in every jurisdictions that we are located.
All right, brilliant. So again, I want to make sure that we have some time to address the questions, if we wouldn't mind. I think there's probably 2 breakdowns. That one question is, of course, following up on Ernesto, and Yanku, I think, could answer it as well. And maybe 2 or 3 of these questions are directed at Julie. So maybe, Julie, would you mind just sharing a little bit more on, first of all, dynamic methodologies, ideas on how to make ESG tools and methodologies dynamic? Another dimension would be, when you try to do product level footprinting, for example, plastic footprinting. I don't know. Could you give us a little bit more insight into what that product level, CO2 emissions would look like? There's another question, of course, Julie, on in your former career or existing career at Chevron, has anyone used life cycle analysis to allocate emissions appropriate for different products, right? So that's one set of questions. Julie, take a second there just to wrap your head around those. And then, of course, the larger question is, of course, mandatory regulations. I think Ernesto has mentioned it, Yanku mentioned it, Kathy has mentioned it as well. The TCFD and the need for mandatory regulations. Are we? We're getting close to this. Is this kind of universally wanted by institutional investors, corporates? Is mandatory requirements too heavy-handed? I guess. Maybe Julie, do you want to handle that? Or,
yeah. I'll start it off, and I think it'll bring in some of the other panelists as well in the answer. So I'm going to go kind of backwards forwards from maybe where you started, because I think that we do need company level data, we need product level data, and then we need also kind of the exchanges and ways that we trade commodities and that commodities work. We need it kind of at that level basis. So if I think about the way that Chevron's approaching it and working with others to approach it, we do report in our sustainability tables the aggregate information for the company. Then on the main products that we produce, oil and gas, we put on an equity basis. So whether we own it or operate it, we put the performance on a product level basis. Now a lot of what we're trying to do is work down that next level to take it into account on an individual facility level basis, so that it can go into things like exchanges and be in contracts. So I think you need all of these levels, and I think the question about life cycle reporting is really interesting. I think absolutely we look at it. We're looking at this on a different basis, like on a life cycle basis is where I think the world is trying to move to, because if you produce a certain product, then you can see emissions. If you own production and somebody else that produces it, say if you're an asset manager, you can kind of see the equity emissions there as well. But what if you don't own or operate, but you're buying it from somebody who tolls it as contract manufacturing, right? So all of these things, and having it on a life cycle basis where you can add up the parts of the value chain up until the point at which you transfer that product, think in standard Incoterms, right? When you're transferring that product to somebody else, is all needed. And life cycle analysis is really part of the base of that, so that you can track it from, from people could say cradle to grave, cradle to shelf, at whatever point of the value chain that you're transferring it. So that's what we're working a lot on right now, is to use kind of, then going to that question around digital and dynamic, is for the first time, I think you have this, this coming together of the technologies available and the methodologies and thought and societal interest to have a push to be able to have everyone come together, whether it's Kathy and her role in looking at how you bring together standardized emissions methodologies, right? Whether it's Young Group as an asset manager and asking us for this information, or Ernesto from kind of that wider sector to really dive down into the individual sectors in the economy to put it together from a national standpoint, is that you have all of these things now coming together with the technologies to be able to trace it through the system, even transferred across borders, right? So now we see for the first time, I think what a lot of us thought would be years off, and it's, coming in maybe a couple of years instead of a decade, right? Border carbon adjustments and these types of concepts where you really are trying to trace it through the value chain, and you need those digital tools to be able to manage the information. So if I use like just another analogy, because I'm sure you've seen that I'm a fan of analogies, right, is that if it's like using your bank account information. I don't know if anyone remembers, even because I was just talking to someone yesterday, like, who uses checks anymore? Like, who actually wants to like write a check? And if you've been at a supermarket, and someone's going to write a check, you're like, I get moved to another line, right? Like having that thing where you write the check and you wait you have to balance it out, and then you have to wait for it to come, right? Which is kind of where we're at right now, except it's a year plus in arrears, right? Versus where we are with online banking right now, and you can see it in all these like digital tracking where you can just transfer it, and it automatically just happens, right? So I had a contractor who said, I can take check, and I said, well, don't you have digital payment tools? Can I just pay you immediately and like bump my phone or something? So all of these things, right, it's happening across not just the emissions accounting, it's happening across digital technology tools, is transferring tracking, it's happening across our entire economy. So it's so exciting to be part of global markets right now and be involved in trying to start this process, because I think it has relationships to all of us that are on this panel, and I think why we were assembled here today.
Brilliant, brilliant, wonderful response. Maybe we hand over to Yanku on the transparency metrics, the need for mandatory indicators, and see if, even if it is a check that comes once a year, is that good enough? And what are you pushing for, when you engage with companies around the world?
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on this banking analogy because I think it's interesting, right? There are many things around regulation, but I would argue it didn't necessarily switch to digital banking because of regulation mandating it, right? So what I'm trying to suggest is we've gone and spoken rightfully so about what data we don't have, what is needed, all that. I think that a little bit obscures the fact that we do have a lot to get a start on, Within Elgin, for example, the metrics we assess companies on, they're public on our website, both climate-specific ratings for around 1,000 companies. Companies can see individual data points, and if they're sort of red, amber, or green, more broadly with ESG scores, with methodology. So there's an element of transparency because we want to tell companies what we expect, also the gaps, obviously. And I think this issue around supply chain, Scope 3 emissions, I think this is very important, and it's probably the biggest gap, we would argue. Not so much necessarily in this sort of very academic sense, what is the perfect way to map a supply chain? I think it's more if you think about it from a kind of revenue risk, right? I want to understand where you're exposed to potentially more stringent regulation, not so much to perfectly allocate everything. So that matters quite a lot, but you already have quite a lot of tools that capital is moving on the back of this. That's also very important to say. It's not just that we're waiting for perfect information. Yes, we can do more with regulation, we could do more with better data, but there's quite a lot that's happening already, and probably everyone on the call here is on the call because they're aware of that, not because they need to be told that. But that's one thing I would say, that there is enough capital is moving. Some of our requirements are public. I think indeed there is transparency, full life cycle, that matters quite a lot. Thinking and tackling your emissions about the value chain. I know in the US, this is a very live example. Companies sometimes don't want to disclose because they don't want to seem to be responsible. We say, don't take responsibility, but take action on your value chain. Slightly different legal nuance, but I think it matters quite a lot. And of course, more regulation if possible, and if it's standardized and it helps, absolutely, we're supportive of that. But there's much happening on the ground, even in parallel with regulation.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, so maybe we have time for one more question. I don't know, Kathy, Ernesto, anything else on those two questions answered? Oh, fun. Sound good? All right, cool. So yeah, I think there's two questions that are on the regarding net zero. I mean, there's been a lot of commitments made across corporations, but also nation states. And again, insofar as perhaps everyone is advanced with dynamic reporting, sensors, calibration, product level, like Julie and some of probably the oil and gas competitors who are probably have been at this for 15 plus years, they are, I guess, the most farthest along down the pathway of measuring accurately. Can we believe these net zero commitments insofar as most corporations don't have this level of granularity data captured within the corporate entity or in the sovereign at the nation state? Can we trust that with its current form of data and reporting? Can net zero targets be achieved or properly measured and also be committed to? Anyone want to take that maybe?
I could start off on that.
Perfect.
So I think net zero targets are very ambitious. But I also think that setting out those ambitions is really important if you're trying to drive behavior change. It's sort of the dichotomy between setting a goal that you know that you can meet and what behaviors and actions that incentivizes versus setting that ambition that you don't know you can meet, you don't know how you're going to meet it, but sort of setting it out there and understanding what behaviors and incentives that sets up. So I think having these net zero targets is important. And I think it broadens the conversation. It's led to a lot more conversation about scope 3 emissions, understanding more about the value chain and not shifting between different stages of the life. And I think it's important for consumers to understand what impact they're having when they're using those products. So I think I'll leave it there just because I know we're tight on time here.
Yeah, perfect. Anyone else on the panel, speakers, want to comment on the net zero, whether those are accurate, whether we can trust them, whether we have the proper metrics and reporting standards in place to actually help the corporations follow through?
I'd be very happy, very briefly. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
If you want to go ahead, so.
No, Janko, please.
Okay, so very briefly, I think if it's just a commitment with nothing else behind it, obviously there are good reasons to be skeptical. And we've structured within our LGMR engagement with many of the largest companies around exactly that. Tell us if you have a pathway. But I think more broadly, it's good to think from our view of net zero targets, a bit like the extractive industries has been thinking about fatalities. You know, 0 is really the only acceptable number. We might understand there might be years where you might fall short, you might not always be able to do it, but it should definitely be what you're aspiring to. Absolutely, at least as concerns your own company boundaries and operations. But I think increasingly there's a question around broadening it, scope 3 challenge.
From my side, I was just going to say that I would say these are good signals. There's, of course, a risk, a reputational risk for governments that take these ambitious commitments. I would say public finance, of course, is one of the most powerful tools to accelerate the global progress, the famous finance golden key. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, investors and the demand side have to be monitoring and asking for results on this. And of course, industries would have to be more resilient and more aware of the possibilities of new regulations and necessities from the regulatory side. So I would say that's the behavioral change that, as Kathy said, is relevant on this matter. As we saw recently from the UK, this agenda of relevant points towards decarbonization of industries. And of course, there's also the political strength or the pressure in terms of the agendas that we see globally. But I think it's a good sign. Some other countries should follow on that to take into account these type of measures.
All right, brilliant. So I think that we're probably all right, have other meetings and other schedules, want to be respectful of everyone's time. Again, I hope this was very informative. I learned a number of things. I thought it was actually a very, very insightful conversation. And, I think look forward to any follow-ups, reach out to the leadership here at IHS and World Bank and see if you need any follow-up materials, and we could provide those and the speakers.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all the speakers for a great discussion, and thank you for all the attendees for joining today. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at innovateforclimate@worldbank.org. And thank you all and have a great day. Bye.
Wonderful.